College of Business at DePaul, specifically the Department of Finance and Real Estate. We're an applied research center, which I feel like I need to put that applied before the research, just because when you're based at a university, I think a lot of folks assume you're publishing for academic publications, and that's not really what we do. Our work is really all oriented to informing practitioners who are working in different ways to understand what's happening around housing and neighborhood investment in Chicago and the region, who are developing policies to address certain challenges, who are trying to recalibrate those strategies based on changing conditions. And so all of our work is really oriented towards those types of folks, practitioners, be they community-based organizations, public agencies, financial institutions, the media, a couple folks from past lives who are from CDFIs or from the media here that we've worked with in the past. So I think it's really so that's really what we do. We have a lot of data. So the data that we work with come from a number of different sources. The robust sort of foundation of it is administrative data from different county agencies. So some of the work I'll be talking about here kind of comes from that source. So it essentially starts with data from the assessor. The assessor has, especially the Cook County assessor, has a very rich data set. It's kind of a mess, but they've improved it quite a bit over the years, and we really try to figure out how to work with it to understand the changing housing stock, essentially, in the city. So it starts with this administrative layer of data, and then there's always transactions happening. So it used to be the recorder of deeds, now it's part of the clerk. Property sales, mortgage recordings, foreclosure filings, these are all administrative records that are created to just track what's happening legally, so you can track what's happening. But the byproduct of that is that there are title companies out there that collect this data to check title, right? And we buy that from them essentially, so that we can have a consistent historical record of all these types of transactions. We have essentially every recorded document since like the 90s. We don't use all of it because a lot of it's really obscure and not useful potentially, but we have a lot of data, and we update it consistently every quarter. So we have a fairly real-time sense of what's happening in the housing market. Have that data, use it to produce regular reports, data indicators, other types of information that we publish on our website, so folks can come to our website and look at those things to get a sense of data for their neighborhoods, or look at kind of reports on what's happening in different aspects of housing. But another kind of bigger part of what we do, and kind of my favorite personal part of what we do, is like what we call technical assistance, which is where we work with different practitioners to connect that information to their questions, so that we help, I think, build the capacity of those groups, because not everyone has the ability to work with detailed parcel level data, to make maps, to kind of do data analysis in that level of granularity. So that's how we try to support the kind of housing and community development system in the city and in the region. We're fortunate enough to get some funding that allows us to do a lot of that work without charging these groups, so in a pro bono way, or in a way that we can charge, have a very vastly reduced fee. And it's what I think of as a two-way relationship, because it helps. These relationships help us provide a product to these folks who think that they can use in their work. But at the same time, we learn from what's happening on the ground. So that's why I think we stay connected to these issues as they emerge, as the economy changes, as aspects of housing finance change. How does that manifest itself in neighborhoods? Because we have these relationships with different groups working in different parts of parts of housing and community development at different levels, very granular, community-based to citywide to kind of national. We can stay on top of those issues, and we can turn to our data and say, hey, how does this look? Can we measure it in some way, or can we track it in some way? So I use this as a preamble because the presentation here is really a perfect example of how this all worked. We heard about, we have data on housing affordability. We see from like the census, for example, how housing affordability changes. But what's really behind those pressures? And we heard from community groups like, hey, we're seeing these small rental buildings in our communities being lost. So they come to us and say, hey, can you tell us how this is happening? And so we went through the data to see, can we figure this out? And eventually we figured out a way to understand this and how it was changing. And really over time, it became clear as we built out our work on this area and continued to talk to folks on this topic that this issue of the housing supply, the affordable, lower cost housing supply, was really the driver of affordability pressures in Chicago, but also all over the country. It's not that you have more low-income people renting necessarily, it's that you have fewer affordable units for people to rent. And if you have less supply, then you have more people paying a higher share of their income towards rent when they can find a unit that they can occupy. Right? So it's really a supply challenge in addition to a demand challenge. But really this presentation is going to focus on how changes in the housing stock are affecting housing affordability. So let's see if I can just work this thing.
Is there a presentation?
I think so. Let's see what I can. There we go. Okay. So, anyways, so what I'm going to do in this presentation is kind of give some citywide context and then try to zoom into Edgewater, the North Lakefront neighborhoods, just to kind of see how this area situates within that broader context. So this is a map looking at the share of rental units that are quote unquote affordable. And I say affordable is in quotes because it's really complicated to define affordability. There's so many different ways that one could define affordability. There are government programs that define affordability in a very specific way in terms of who qualifies for certain types of housing, based on your household size, based on the size of the unit. So it would be impossible to do this type of analysis if we were to get that specific in the data. So what we've done is create a bit of a broader definition of affordability. We're saying an affordable rental. So a household that is needing affordable housing is a lower income household. And our definition is that household earns 150% or less of the federal poverty level. So in Chicago in 2021, that was about $41,000 a year for their household income. And an affordable unit would be a rental unit that was available at about 30% of that income on a monthly basis. So that's about a little bit over $1,000 a month for monthly rent, right? So that's sort of defining what we're saying in these maps. So on this map, this is looking at the percent of the rental housing stock in these different submarkets that would be considered affordable, right? So if you look at the, kind of the lighter areas, those are areas where there's a lower share of the rental stock that's affordable, and the darker areas are areas that have a higher share, that are affordable. So, not surprisingly, the areas near downtown, just north of the lakefront, that would be Lincoln Park and Lakeview, have the least affordability. And then areas just adjacent to that, near West Side, Northwest Side, near North Side, that's like North Side and Lincoln Square, Westridge, also relatively less affordability. And then the other areas are sort of average, right? So that's where you see on the North Lakefront, Uptown, Rogers Park, Edgewater, Rogers Park would be that submarket. We're using these geographic definitions because that's what the census has for this data. So relatively speaking, this is Uptown, Edgewater, Rogers Park is the dark color, and the city is the lighter color. First set of bars is the share of the rental supply that's affordable, so roughly 40% in the neighborhood or in the submarket, similar to what you see in the city. How many renters are considered low income? 46% compared to 47% citywide, so again, roughly on par. The third indicator is the share of renters that are low income but are living in a unit that would be unaffordable, like over 30% of the area of the affordability rate, right? So about 38% of low income renters are living in unaffordable units. So if you look at these metrics, you see in 2021, basically the area was on par with the city essentially. But then if you look at change, how things are changing, so going back to 2012 and looking forward to the current date, this is looking at the areas that have lost the most affordability. So the percentage point decline in the share of units that are considered affordable. So if you look up to the North Lakefront, you see that that's an area that has lost the highest share of affordable rental units. So if you look at how these metrics are based on change, you see that 12.5 percentage point decline in the share of units that are affordable compared to about a 6.5% decline citywide, which translates to a declining share of lower income renters. So why is that declining? Is it displacement? Is it folks just moving naturally? Are they making more money? You know, it could be all these things. We're probably combining all those things with what's really happening. But in a lot of these contexts, it's folks leaving the neighborhood or you know, being displaced because there's a lack of affordability. And then on the final side, I think is the most compelling potentially is an increase significantly larger than the city average of the share of lower income renters living in higher cost units. So that's sort of the story, you know, citywide that's happening, and in the kind of North Lakefront set of neighborhoods, it's happening more rapidly. So that's why when you think about, is there an affordability crunch in Edgewater, Uptown, Rogers Park? You know, this is kind of an indicator that, yeah, it looks like that's happening in the neighborhoods. So our general theory is that because there's a declining number of low-income renters, that it's, you know, likely a supply, a big question is on supply. So we've started to dig into what's happening on the housing stock. This is, you know, look at change in the share of rental units in different types of housing between 2012 and 2021, citywide. You know, on the far right, you see there's been an increase in the number of rental units in buildings earning, you know, in buildings with more than 50 units. So when you think about where is new construction happening, what types of buildings are being, you know, built out for rental housing, those tend to be the bigger buildings downtown or in certain neighborhoods, you know, along the North Lakefront. Larger buildings, new construction, expensive typically. Similarly, the 5 to 49 unit buildings, an increase in the number of rental units in those properties. So these larger multi-unit buildings are where you're seeing growth in rental housing in the city. If you look at this side, you see declining number of rental units in 2 to 4 unit buildings, so small rental properties, and in single family units as well. There was a big increase in single family rentals after the Great Recession. So I think what we're seeing now is that going back to normal. But the 2 to 4 unit stock is really where historically a lot of neighborhoods have, you know, had their rental housing, you know, kind of come from, especially lower cost rental housing. So that's where we've sort of started digging into what's happening on that particular segment of the market. Was there a question?
Just to understand it, so the 2 to 4 unit and a negative 10% means there's 10% fewer?
It means there are 10%, a decline of 10% of the rental units found in those types of buildings.
So we look at all the, it's of the whole rental market? I'm trying to figure out.
Just of the, so in, you know, let's say, I'm going to do simple math here, because I can only do simple math in my head on the fly here. 100 units in 2 to 4 unit buildings in 2012, 90 units in 2021, right? So
is that due to condo conversion or tear downs?
Well, funny you should ask. That's what I'll be getting into in of course. But yeah,
you're going a little too fast for some of it.
I got you. I will try to. I'll try to slow it down. But yeah, if you have questions, shout it out.
You have another cup of coffee.
I might have had too much coffee. Apparently, that's not really the problem. But so yeah, so you see kind of a shift in the rental supply. Essentially, we're shifting towards larger buildings. Which tend to be those newer construction buildings tend to be less affordable, so you're losing, you know, maybe lower cost units on one end, adding higher cost units on the other end. So a transition in the rental market citywide, and this is just showing in terms of the share of rental units citywide that are found in these different types of properties. So the red line is the share of rental units in Chicago in 2 to 4 unit buildings. 2012 on the left, 2021 on the right. So you see that 2 to 4s make up plurality, right? They're the most common type of rental housing in the city, but it went down from 38% to 32% over that period of time, whereas the 2 middle lines, 5 to 49s and 50 plus, both saw increases in their share of the.
And that was as of 3 years ago. By this point, it might be.
It could be more, yeah. I mean, the data is a bit of a lag, unfortunately, and don't get me started on the census and when they change their geographies, so you have to sort of, update the data with 2020's boundaries. So we're kind of stuck at 2021 at this point, but so we do some more complex updates. But yeah, so that's sort of what that means, right? This slide translates to this basically in terms of what types of housing make up the rental stock. So just to kind of get into the sort of transitioning into the conversation on affordability, I think when many people think of affordable housing, it's sort of this capital A affordable housing, which is subsidized affordable housing, meaning the unit is directly connected to a type of government subsidy that keeps it affordable for a certain period of time. It makes it affordable to a certain renter of a certain income for a certain period of time. Or there's a renter who has like a voucher or some type of income subsidy that they can take with them to the unit, to the landlord, that helps the landlord keep it affordable, right? Pays the landlord part of the rent. So this is a slide looking at the share of housing units in a neighborhood that are connected to some type of subsidy, right? So it's mainly meant to illustrate that subsidy makes up a relatively small portion of the housing stock. So the far right is sort of project-based Section 8, which is kind of a common type of housing subsidy. So in Uptown, which is the far kind of dark bar, 8.5% of housing units are coming from that, or associated with that type of subsidy, yes.
Is this from the city itself? I think it's important to break it down to Edgewater versus the city.
Yeah, so each of the bars, so just, there's a laser finger?
Yeah, there's a little red.
Oops, oh no, it's a terrible thing, I've ruined everything, I think. Oh, I fixed it, okay. Yeah, sorry, if it's, here we go. So there's a tiny laser, I'll try to, you can't. So on the far right, this light gray bar, that's the city of Chicago. The dark bar here is Uptown. The light blue is Edgewater, and then the gray is Rogers Park. Okay, so Uptown has, the highest share of project-based Section 8 rental housing. So it's a federal subsidy that tends to flow through the city of Chicago, and Uptown has the highest share of units associated with that type of subsidy. There's housing choice vouchers. Rogers Park, of all the three neighborhoods, has the highest share of units associated with that type of voucher, not tied to a specific unit, but connected to the renter. And then public housing, these are sort of for very low income households. Uptown has the highest. So where does Edgewater sit amongst all these? It's basically slightly above average related to the city for project-based Section 8, below average compared to the city for housing choice voucher units, and pretty low relative to the city and relative to Uptown, relative for some public housing.
Quick question of clarification on the public housing, does that include family and senior CHA?
So I think it does, yeah. And so the data source doesn't break it down in that detail, it's just public housing, but I would imagine if it's funded through the CHA, it would be considered public housing, yeah.
Are you able to, like, I think about public housing, I think about green, like, how much public housing like that is left in the city? Has there been a downward trend generally?
Right, so that style of public housing, yes. But there's other types of public housing that don't quite look the same, I guess. So you do have a lot of public, not a lot, I mean, 1.3% of the city's housing units are some type of, public housing project, right, of some sort. So not a ton.
Well, Edgewater has a lot of
Scattered sites.
senior housing.
Right, I would,
Probably
so
the predominance of the Edgewater.
it could be, yeah, the data source that we have doesn't disaggregate the public housing by who is occupying it. If it's for seniors, if it's for low-income households, or some other, potential type of renter. So don't really know from this data source, but yeah, so that's, there's not a ton of it right now. And I think if you were to go to different neighborhoods, obviously you see some variation even amongst these three in the North Lakefront, you'd see a lot of variation. But this is just, the intent of this slide is just to kind of show that there is affordable housing, capital A affordable housing in the area, but it generally makes up a small percentage of the total housing stock. So in Edgewater, if you add these up, about under 5% of the housing stock would be connected to some type of affordability subsidy.
Geoff, is that rental housing is the
So the
total
universe
housing
here is
units?
total housing units, not just rental units. So it is a little bit, so we did that because some areas don't have a lot of rental housing, so it would be a little, it could be deceptive potentially if you're looking
So
at
it's
areas.
the total housing
This is
stock.
total housing stock, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Does this in any way work into the need for affordable housing? I mean, if there's a if nobody really, if the need for it is lower, why should somebody worry about expanding?
Well, so I think that there's not enough. I mean, so so when we think of demand, like so you said the share of low-income renters is going down, okay, but are there enough low-income affordable units to even meet that demand? That would be, no, a mismatch still. And so, and even if you kind of go beyond low-income renters, just overall rental affordability, that sort of mismatch creates a lack of affordability, which creates, sort of a rising housing costs in general. So I think that, well, what I'll get into here, so maybe transitioning to just what types of housing make up, what types of housing units make up the neighborhood. Earlier I showed for the city how, 2 to 4 unit buildings were the predominant, had the plurality of rental housing. So here is what it looks like across these slightly different data source, I will note. These are not just rental units, by the way. These are all housing units, so it's a little different. The numbers will be a little different than what I showed previously. But for Edgewater, which is at the top here, I'm trying to turn off the presentation again. So Edgewater, 5.3% of total housing units, single-family homes, 37.5% in condos, 10.3% in 2 to 4s, 47-ish% in 5+ multifamily rental buildings. Yes.
Yeah, it might be helpful to us if you could put these percentages in terms of numbers. For example, what is the total number of housing units in Edgewater? That way we can better visualize numerically what you're talking about.
So I don't have that number, unfortunately, off the top of my head. The reason we try to do it in percentages in this case is because communities are different in terms of the number of housing units. We want to try to compare what the distribution looks like in the neighborhood compared to what the distribution looks like in the city. So just trying to, as a way to normalize the data a bit and compare it across geographies that might be slightly different. We're doing it as a percentage, and unfortunately I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm happy to, if you want to follow up.
Edgewater has about 30,000 housing units,
Okay.
I think. Mark, is that about right? 30,000 housing units?
It's about right.
That's our close, yeah.
It's roughly 30,000.
30,000. Okay. Yes.
Okay, so I've seen this district before, but breaking it down to like apartment size and then condos is not an accurate portrayal because some of the larger apartment buildings are condos. So it's not a breakdown of condos as one entity and then larger apartment buildings as a separate category.
Right.
Because
So
in Edgewater, the majority of the large buildings, I'm sure you know, are condominiums.
So just to be clear about what this data is showing, so I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question or not, or make you happy with the data or not, but so what it's showing is, this is units, right? So for condos, each pin is 1 unit, and then for the rental buildings, we know the number of units in that rental building. So this is housing units, not necessarily parcels. So if you were talking about parcels, then there would be a 50-unit condo building would be 50 parcels, and a 50-unit apartment building would be 1 parcel.
I mean, you're saying there's a certain percentage of units in buildings above a certain number, okay?
Yes.
Is that the last category?
This is rent, so the last category would be just rental
And then you
units.
also have a category, number of units in condominiums.
Yes. So the blue line is,
I've seen it elsewhere, so it's not necessarily from you, it's from other.
yeah, so what we've tried, just to clarify what this data is. So this is units in different types of housing. So we like to distinguish condos from rental buildings because the condo is typically intended to be an owner-occupied unit versus a 50+ unit rental or 5+ unit rental building is a rental property. And then also from like an assessment purpose, condos are individually assessed. Buildings over 7 units are assessed as a commercial property, so income-producing property. So we're trying to distinguish between the units that come from those different types of properties. So I think.
So the gray bars are all rental.
Yes, they should be all
So
rentals.
and the blue represents All condos, no matter what type of building they're in.
Continuing on this bit of overlap or confusion, I don't see any breakout for multifamily co-ops. I'm pretty sure there's at least one major
So
co-op.
they would be
In
grouped
Edgewater.
with the 5+ unit rentals.
What?
That would be grouped in the 5+. We've sort of tried to, so within each of these categories, there are other subcategories of like, mixed-use properties that have a commercial storefront and units on top. So we've tried to simplify it for presentation purposes, but underneath these categories, there are other subcategories.
Co-ops are a
wouldn't co-ops-
significant breakout related to affordability though.
Yes, no question. But so just to kind of try to get it to a general audience, we can get into some of the importances of the different types of housing beneath this. If we haven't had to discuss that further. But,
Yeah.
so this is what the housing stuff looks like. Obviously nuances here, but we're trying to generalize a bit just to highlight bigger rental buildings are typically more common, and more condo buildings are the most common type of housing in Edgewater. Relatively small share of units in 2 to 4s, but 10% is still, over 10% we still think of as a relatively substantial portion of the neighborhood, and the built environment is such you have patterns and blocks that are more likely to have more of those than others, right? So this slide here, I apologize in advance, because it's complicated, but so what we're trying to show is how long has a building been owned continuously by the same entity, okay? So the way we track this is through looking at the last time a property sold for an amount of money, so an arm's length transaction. Now, understanding the ways the properties may transfer ownership with family members or without an amount of money, we can't really track that in the same way, but we're trying to track when did a property sell for an amount of money. And so what we're looking at here is the dark blue bar is the share of just the 5+ unit rental buildings that last sold before 2000, right? So they've been owned by the same entity for at least 20 years, right? So you can see across all, Edgewater is the far left, Rogers Park, Uptown City. For the most part, long-term owners are the most common type of owner for multi-family rental buildings. Edgewater has a higher share of long-term owners than other parts of the North Lakefront or the city. Indicator probably, of it's a good area for income-producing properties, so owners hang on to the properties for a long time and don't tend to.
It's a good neighborhood to live in,
Yeah.
stay.
Yeah, right. So these are landlords typically, so the other bars, just to kind of go through it, the progression here. This one is the property last sold between 2000 and 2007. The reason we chose that window is that aligns with the housing bubble. The gray bar here is properties that sold between 2008 and 2011. That was when the market crashed, Great Recession kind of time period. Lower levels of turnover there. This gray bar here is properties that sold between 2012 and 2019, which is the next biggest category. A lot of demand for rental housing, so there was a lot of interest in purchasing rental buildings in that time period. And then this bar here, which you probably can't see if you're not really close, is since 2020, so the COVID time period. So why is this important? Why do I think it's important? We think it's important is because there are some theories that would say that when you think about this, so I mentioned earlier this kind of capital A affordable housing, right? It's housing that's connected to a subsidy that's guaranteed to be affordable because it's connected to that subsidy program. It makes up a relatively small portion of the overall housing stock in most neighborhoods. So where do people go to find low-cost housing if it's not tied to a subsidy? They go to the market, right? So they try to just go out into the neighborhood and try to, look however they can through relationships, through Craigslist, through whatever you do, apartments.com, whatever you do to track down an apartment, they try to find it on the market. So there are, in that universe of market rate housing, there are units that are lower cost and there are units that are really expensive. That's why I was trying to highlight earlier. A lot of the new construction that's happening recently tend to be higher cost units. A lot of the older buildings that have been owned continuously by the same landlord, same owner for 20 plus years tend to be more affordable. So this particular bar is really important to understanding sort of what some people will call naturally occurring affordable housing. Many people despise that term. I like it because it's easy, but I'm lazy in that way. But it's sort of just low-cost market rate rental housing. And it's typically provided by these long-term owners who own smaller buildings that are, not have all the bells and whistles. It just provides, lower-cost rental buildings. And a lot of that is in, sort of these older, longer-term owned properties.
We probably have a few of those landlords
Sure.
here in the audience.
Sure, yes.
Could I just point
Yeah,
out
go
that,
ahead.
I mean, I think in aggregate, what it shows is that Edgewater has been the most stable, if you will, of the three far north lakefront communities.
To keep the rents affordable, so rents would have to increase to offset those costs. Or they might decide, hey, I own this building for 25 years, I'm tired of being a landlord, I'm just gonna sell it because that's my, equity, whatever, my wealth is tied up into that, and I wanna do something else, right? So that's one way that, property taxes, building maintenance, insurance, all these costs, as they go up, put pressure on rents, and might put pressure on the owners to turn it over and sell it to the next person, right? So that's where this next slide comes in, and why that turnover can potentially erode affordability. So this is, so this is, if you bought your 5+ unit building in Edgewater in 2000, normalizing it based on the price per unit of that acquisition, this is sort of adjusted for inflation to $20-23, so all the years are basically in $20-23. The unit, it would have cost $68,000 per unit on average. So bought your building then, that's what you paid. You sell it in 2023, the new buyers are paying $191,000 per unit, right? So when the new buyers are paying that premium because the land value has gone up, because rental demand has changed, but when they buy it at that cost, it's probably hard to keep it affordable in the same way that the owner who paid $67,000 per unit back in 2000 did, right? So this turnover, so when folks from this long-term owner, bars can start to sell, that's where that affordability begins to erode because the new buyers are paying current sort of market value for that building. They may also want to invest in the maintenance or the upkeep, improve the building in some way. So that turnover is typically a leading indicator of affordability being eroded. Do you have a question?
Yes, very quickly. So the seller, the person who bought at $67,000 is probably Jane Sixpack. Who's the buyer at 191? Is it tend to be, do we know the data about whether it's another individual person or whether it's a conglomerate of investors?
That's a good question. I mean, so this is all 5+ unit buildings, right? So I'm sure you guys know a vast, lots of variation in that stock. So I'm guessing bigger buildings. The existing owner is maybe, so on the smaller scale, so a building with like 12 units maybe, more likely to be owned by maybe an individual or a small, building owner with a few other buildings perhaps. The bigger ones tend to be owned by more professional management companies, property owners. As it turns over, that is a good question. I mean, I think that we do track the buyers, like the names of the buyers. Hard to know. LLCs are usually have their own names for each of the buildings, so it's hard to know necessarily like are they a big scale buyer, or are they just buying this property? But I do think that over time, as these prices have gone up, that you do tend to see more large scale folks playing a bigger role in the housing market all across the board. But in particular in these sort of
hedge funds have been scooping them up like crazy.
Yeah, I mean that does drive also the value increases because those guys are just paying cash for whatever or so it is sort of affect the market. Yes.
Who's that, John?
The hedge funds.
Oh, really?
I was going to say, Joe Sixpack would be affected by that new transfer tax. So this is a case where I'm just pointing out that that's a case that would have had to pay a higher tax, transfer tax, for the, the family owned six flat.
That's true, but the vast majority, if you're saying that the vast majority of buyers, it's the buyer who pays
The
it,
buyer pays it?
right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for the Bring Chicago Home, or, that would have been the buyer paying the,
Yeah, so you're saying that the vast majority, we're just guessing, but there's a likelihood that there's a great number of buyers who would have been investors. They're not in it to live in it, or live in one unit and rent out the other five.
yeah, for these types of buildings, I mean, it's more common, as far, again, the way we track this would be like homeowner exemptions or something like that, and so not a ton of larger multi-unit buildings with homeowner exemptions, so.
Yeah,
Yeah, so maybe investing, putting in new kitchens, all that kind of stuff, and then.
I guess what I'm saying, that, this is my opinion, you don't have to agree, but I think that so-called tax would have more likely been paid by investor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those larger properties, especially on income producing, like rental buildings, commercial buildings, are more likely would have been investors.
And then my question is, is there a real objection to it, the fact that they don't intend to own them for very long? Because hedge funds can make money by flipping.
Yeah, good question. Are there other questions before moving on here? So that's sort of, one kind of cut of like what's happening on the larger rental side, right? I mean, I think that when you think about this, kind of reiterate a little bit, a lot of the low-cost rental housing comes from these market rate units. The market rate units and their rents are kind of a product of a number of different factors, but one factor would be the condition or the characteristics of the owner. One characteristic might be how long they've owned the property, because that connects to their overhead, their costs, and not going to generalize, obviously, but there might be specific examples that this isn't the case, but in general, those long-term owners probably have slightly lower costs than folks who have bought recently at higher costs, and so that turnover can erode the affordability. And that's part of the reason why, especially in a neighborhood like Edgewater, where you have a lot of housing in those 5+ unit buildings, when you see that drop, and all of the North Lakefront really, you see that drop in the share of units that are affordable, my guess is that most of that drop is tied to stuff like this, right? So it's just turnover of existing buildings. It also could be existing landlords just raising their rents. I mean, that's also a possibility. People can raise their rents. So, that's sort of a thing that does happen, and it's part of a market. So, so that could be happening too. But I'm guessing that affordability pressure is largely connected to, at least, largely connected to this type of turnover. Yes.
How about, is this naive, like, if I see that bulldog, that Frenchie, I mean, I sort of, found out, like, there's one on Sheridan Road, this Flats keeps building this stuff. And none of it seems, it's like, what, $2,000 for one bedroom or something, ridiculous stuff. I mean, that has to affect what's going on. Because other landlords look at that and say, well, if they're getting that.
Right, so you have the new construction, which is not affordable.
Yeah,
You've got the existing housing, which did provide affordability. As it turns over, it's also potentially becoming less affordable. And again, what is replacing that loss of the affordability you're losing in the properties that turn over? There's not a mechanism really to create new affordable housing necessarily without, there are some programs in the city that they require, you get a zoning change, you need to build a couple of units affordable, but at scale, it's not really good.
Well, I was just a real quick, I'm in a courtyard building, a lot of units, and it was an individual who owned it when we moved in, and then it got taken over. I don't know who the owner is, but it's now under a management company, and the rents have remained not bad.
Mm-hmm.
But if so, basically what you're saying is these people maybe sell their property due to whatever. It could be taken over and then everything gets jammed.
Yeah, so this is generalizing about using market trends to kind of think about how that might affect affordability at scale. Obviously there's going to be examples of all sorts of different case-by-case basis that might be different, but I think the trend would indicate that's a risk. Yes.
What you're illustrating here is a basic fact that has been known for a long time and denied by many. And that is that the market, as we understand it, is never going to increase or match the demand for affordable housing.
Right.
It simply isn't.
Yes. I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that's just, you know, we kind of, the kind of way that affordable housing is provided is essentially relying on this type of housing to provide it for most people, and sort of relying on this concept of filtering to kind of create, you know, new housing, and then as this, you build this housing back in, you know, the 70s, and it was fancy and new then, but then 30 years later, you continue to build housing that was fancy and new is now no longer, and that is now affordable. So that's sort of the concept in many ways that people sort of rely on to provide, you know, market rate, low cost housing. But I will say, like, during one of the kind of prevailing theories on why that hasn't continued is that building kind of stopped, you know, in large part in 2012, but demand changed. So it wasn't as much new construction. But demand continued to grow for higher income renters, so that kind of created, kind of an imbalance in supply and demand for certain types of rental housing in certain neighborhoods where that demand was exceptionally increasing. So, but it's kind of a complex, especially when you're in Chicago where it's a big, city and you can move to the next neighborhood. So there are lots of dynamics going on, but yeah, question.
I was just going to point out, all of these neighborhoods are lakefront adjacent properties,
Mm-hmm.
and worldwide, if you're near water, it's more expensive property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I mean, I don't think we tend to think about that in the equation of housing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's obviously a desirable neighborhood for sure, and that's a big part of the big amenity, I imagine.
So your previous slide showed that there's a big loss of affordable housing in those near west neighborhoods too, right? So I agree with the desirability of water and access to the L, but it seems like it's now changing.
Well, part of it is, part of it is like, the North Lakefront neighborhoods have a different housing stock. That's one issue, I think. Been established as a certain type of real estate market for a while, whereas some of the neighborhoods on the west side maybe are more generous, have a different type of starting point, and not, that causes that affordability loss to accelerate potentially because they were more affordable at one point. So there's, like I said, there's a lot of variation across the city in the market context. Yes.
Please clarify, I thought that one of the proposed solutions was housing units get more expensive, but there would be a set aside that some number of those units would need to stay affordable. I thought that was kind of like a fix that had been suggested. Does that not work?
Well, so that is one. So there's lots of different policy tools that are, trying to address this. One of the policy tools I think you're referencing is specifically related to new construction properties, where the developer has to get a zoning change to build their building, right? So in order to get the zoning change, the city said, we're going to give you this zoning change. In exchange for that, we're going to require that you have a certain number of units in your development be affordable, or you can pay a fee, per unit fee, into a fund that then can be used for affordable housing. So it's triggered for new construction properties, and the fee, I think it's changed recently, but it's like 10 to 20% of the units should be affordable, and the fee is kind of varies based on where you are. If you're downtown, you pay a higher fee. If you're in a higher cost neighborhood like Edgewater, you pay a little bit lower fee, and if you're in like a lower cost neighborhood, you pay a different fee for buyout essentially. So, but that is one of the city's policy tools that they have to try to leverage demand for that new construction properties, and then create some type of affordability from that. So it's called the Affordable Apartments Ordinance. Yes.
I just wanted to second what Steve said, and just to say something about the idea of the private market building its way out of this affordability supply or lack of it. I remember I looked at this about 20 or 25 years ago, that when there was rental housing was starting to be built downtown, and I realized there was a lot of it actually being built downtown, and I thought, where is this being built in the neighborhoods? And I realized, you basically had to have a rent at that time, about 20 years ago, of like $2,500 a month to justify the private market building new construction for rental housing. And I realize, well, nobody likes rents going up that much. If you don't have that, it's not like you don't have upscale housing, you don't have any housing because the private market can't produce it. And so, I mean, that's why this affordable requirements ordinance, if you get 20% of, you're getting 20% of something, that it wouldn't be there otherwise. The other thing I would say is that we have to remember the relationship of our neighborhood to other neighborhoods like all over the south and west side, which you have up on there, Jeff, that have they have a supply of affordable housing, but they still have dramatic need. They have they're basically empty neighborhoods. So many of these areas have lost 75% of the population. And I just want to say that as those neighborhoods are unlivable, most people move into a more concentrated number of neighborhoods, like the North Lakefront, like Edgewater, and so forth, so that we benefit actually in affordability to the degree that those neighborhoods get to be better places to live, too. And I just want to say these citywide policies to drive more development on the south and west side, that's a really good thing for us, too, because it helps to balance out the whole city.
Yeah. Now this focuses primarily on the North Lakefront, which is a certain market context. As Jack mentioned, there's different story on the south and west sides, where you have a lot of affordable housing relative to the city averages, but you also have a lot of really low income households. So even though you have cheap housing, folks are still cost burdened, and there's all sorts of other population loss, which affects demand, and so there's all sorts of different dynamics on those neighborhoods than in the North Lakefront neighborhoods. So I'm going to just blast through the next few slides because I don't want to, I'm sure you guys want to get lunch at some point, but so this is like transitioning to
You can't leave, you got to stay for 5 hours.
I mean, I'm happy to talk about this stuff all day long, but just sort of transitioning to that other sort of segment of the housing market, that 2 to 4 unit stock, which, again, not insignificant in Edgewater, about 10%, but not making up, a huge portion of the stock. But so a lot of our work has been looking at this 2 to 4 unit segment as well. So basically, it's an iconic type of housing in the city, but it's also really old. Average age is over 100 years. 2 to 4s, if you think about them citywide, they play a very distinct role in the neighborhood housing stock of many communities. I mean, there are some places where 2 to 4s make up over 70% of the housing units in, Brighton Park or McKinley Park or Albany Park. Those are areas where the stock is predominantly 2 to 4s. So that's, other parts, they tend to, even if they're not the predominant type of housing, they often do provide the lowest cost rental housing in a neighborhood because they tend to be owned, thinking about the continuum of owners, 2 to 4s are almost exclusively owned by these small scale owners, owner occupants oftentimes. So they make up the backbone of the affordable housing stock in many neighborhoods. They make up the relatively low cost housing stock in a lot of other neighborhoods. Another thing that's important for these 2 flats is that thinking about when they were built, they have multiple bedrooms, so a lot of the units are bigger units, so they can provide not just lower cost housing, but housing for families. A lot of the new construction buildings are oriented towards smaller households, so they don't have multiple bedrooms. So if you're thinking about how do you have modest income families living in a neighborhood, this type of housing across the city often provides, that unit. They often, looking at some of the data, they often serve households of color, especially as a way to buy housing. We put out a report, last year showing that Black and Latino home buyers are more likely to purchase 2 to 4 unit buildings than other types of housing because, again, they're not that they're cheaper, but you can have multiple generations living in the building. You can defray the cost of your mortgage by having renters. So in lots of parts of the cities, it's an important type of housing to the neighborhood, to the housing context, to just affordability in general. But it's being lost and eroded. And as I mentioned, we talked about with SROs, with other types of housing, as you lose it, there's really no mechanism to rebuild 2 flats as affordable rental housing. If you see a new construction 2 flat or 4, it's condos these days, really. So you really see the new construction buildings are single family homes that are really expensive, condos that are really expensive, or large scale rental buildings that are really expensive. Those are kind of the types of buildings that are built these days. So, yes.
How widespread is the phenomenon to convert 2 flats into single family houses?
funny you should ask. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So just sort of thinking about, citywide, this is between 2012 and 2019. I can say that we updated this data internally, although we haven't made all the fancy slideshows of it yet, so I'm not going to, so the data is going to go through 2019 for many of these, but the trend kind of continued. Citywide lost about 4.2% of the units, so the 2 to 4 unit parcels citywide, but if you look at the market context, right, so high cost neighborhoods, meaning neighborhoods where the housing, for sale housing prices were in the top third of the city, those areas lost the most, 7% of their housing, 2 to 4 stock was lost in that time period. Lower cost neighborhoods lost 3.5%, so the next most. And they're for reasons that Jack alluded to earlier, disinvestment, deterioration, and then demolition of those units. And then this moderate cost, middle price neighborhoods, that's actually where the stock is functioning, probably in how it has typically functioned as, owner-occupant housing, rental housing, that's pretty stable there.
Which of those categories are we?
Sorry?
Which of those columns are we in?
So yeah, Edgewater, so here's the map of Edgewater. Here's the map of the city. So the red is going to be high cost, so not surprisingly, north side, northwest side, little pockets like Bridgeport, Hyde Park, Kenwood, Ashburn, those are some pockets otherwise that are considered high cost in this map. Green, moderate cost, blue, low cost. And the dots represent a lost 2 to 4. So you can see it's, the pattern is highly concentrated on the north side and in a lot of neighborhoods, kind of that are red. So this is quickly summarizing where you see the biggest loss. It's kind of concentrated in a small number of areas. Westtown, Lakeview, North Center, Lincoln Square tend to make up this is like, so you would read this chart as, of all the 2 to 4s that are lost, 11% of them were in Westtown, right? So this is sort of adds up to 100% if you add up the whole chart going down to 77 community areas. These top five make up 44% of the total lost 2 to 4. So concentrated in those 5 neighborhoods. This is just lost for any reason, not conversion to single family, not demolition, just any reason that it went away. This is what they asked.
Condoing as well. Yeah.
Condoing as well, right. So where does Edgewater sit? A little bit above average. So 4.2% was the total loss. Edgewater's so these are neighborhoods that are kind of north side, lakefront. So North Center, Lakeview, the biggest rate of loss. North Center lost 14%, Lakeview 13%, so Edgewater not nearly as rapid, but above the city average, which was 4.2%. Yes?
So that 5.3% for Edgewater, is that of the 2 to 4 unit buildings?
Of the 2 to 4 unit, of buildings that were considered 2 to 4s in 2013, there was when you look at 2019, there was a loss of 5.3%.
Okay, so it's the number of units? Or
This is parcels. This number is based on parcels. So
how will you define a parcel?
a parcel would be sort of, so the assessor values, when they value properties, right? They value the building, right? So it's the building that was, so a 2 to 4 unit building, there's so Edgewater, I think, lost 80 parcels and about 160 or so units.
One out of every 20.
What?
One out of every 20.
Yeah, basically, yeah. So this is the number of buildings, not a number of units.
Okay, buildings.
Yeah. And then just zooming in. So this is Edgewater zoomed in. So Jack was asking, what's Edgewater? So Edgewater here is red, right? So it's considered a high cost area. This is sort of those dots, by the way. We do have maps that have the dots connected to the specific parcel. This is not one of those maps. This is a dot density map. So
And the white dots?
the white dots are CTA train stations. The black dots, are
Which is affordable, by the way.
So you can see, basically east of the alley, east of Broadway, basically it's not a lot. There aren't a lot of 2 to 4s there anyways. So this is where you see the most. And so you kind of compare.
So every one of those dots is a loss?
Yeah. Yes.
Most likely conversions to single family.
Yeah,
homes.
so getting into
there haven't been that many teardowns in Edgewater.
Yeah, getting into what happens, right? So citywide, the most common type of outcome for a property that was a 2-flat and is not a 2-flat, 47% of those citywide became single-family homes. 29% became some type of non-residential land use, which more often than not is a vacant lot. And then the other two, 13%, which were disappeared, they didn't just poof, but they essentially converted into it, the pins changed, right? So that's usually a condoing. And then 9.5% is some other type of residential property, which is a rental building. So in those cases, it's often someone added a unit through a basement unit, an attic unit, a subdividing of so that's oftentimes what happened there is that the building had 4 units, and then someone added a unit, and now it's not a 2 to 4. That's the least common, 9.5% of the lost 2 to 4s were lost in that. Yes.
Do you have anything more to add about that almost 30% that used to be a 2-flat or a 4-flat and now is vacant land?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
is there any trend? I mean, kind of the why.
Well, so again, thinking about this is citywide.
Yeah.
So I didn't get into it too much in the subsequent slides, but basically those are concentrated in the lower cost neighborhoods. So Englewood, for example, has the most 2 to 4s that were lost and became a vacant lot because, these are older buildings, require ongoing maintenance. If you see population loss, lost rental demand, lack of investments in the building, in the neighborhood, those buildings deteriorate and get demolished. And that's sort of what happens in this context.
So the accumulation of individuals that have stories.
Yes, well, no, there is a unique subset of north side vacant lots too. I mean, I think the most recent example, and it's always featured in Cranes, and it's always like an athlete, or I think in this case it was the Cubs general manager. I don't know if you guys read Cranes or not, but the Cubs general manager bought a 2-flat across the street from his current home and demolished it, and it's a vacant lot, and they didn't redevelop it or something, so it's sitting there vacant, right? So it's like in some high cost areas, I remember Nicholas Jalmerson, who was a defenseman for the Hawks. I remember reading this in the Cranes as well, and it was like, he bought the lot next to his building and demoed it because they wanted a side yard, right? So folks who have enough money to buy their buildings can do that.
There's a lot of that in Roscoe Village.
Yeah.
We had one case in Edgewater, Lakewood, Balmoral, where that happened.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon. If you have the ability to do it, then that's another example of this type of thing, but most commonly on the southwest sides. Yes?
Question. Mayor calls you and says, what do you recommend to deal with the affordability crisis in Chicago?
Mm-hmm.
What advice would you give the mayor?
Well, I mean, I think what we usually try to point to is this idea of preservation in the sense that, there's been a lot of reporting recently on the cost of building new affordable housing. So if you build a new affordable housing development, it's super expensive because it takes forever. And it's really on a per unit basis. I think there was something like $800,000 a unit or something, really costly and not nimble. So building new affordable housing is important because it creates dedicated affordable units, but it's not maybe the most effective way to do it efficiently. As I mentioned, the reason I'm kind of going through this slide presentation to talk about this existing stock is that, thinking about ways to keep the existing stock affordable, be it in a 5+ unit larger rental buildings or in the smaller 2-flats, are there ways to support existing owners so that they don't feel like they need to sell? Are there...
what might those policy initiatives be?
Well, I mean, it could be, there's a whole array of potential things. I mean, there's a lot of conversations around home improvement, right, or maintenance, like grants or low-cost loans to support building maintenance, because that might be a thing that triggers a sale if you need to make some type of repair. If there's a need for a major repair on a building, there's a subsidy program. Where Jack used to work, they were they were advocates to create this property tax relief program for folks who were to buy and substantially rehab a larger building. You freeze the value of the assessed value of that building at that pre-improvement rate for 10 years. So it's an incentive to invest in that building. I mean, you have to keep the units affordable as well. So it's sort of an incentive to invest in a property, improve it, keep it affordable, while keeping your tax burden stable over a period of time, right? So there's strategies like that can incentivize it. There's vehicles like land trusts that people like to talk about, or there are mission-oriented owners that when you see a property turning over, some cities, none of these are super successful at scale, I will note, but there are things that people are increasingly trying to figure out how to make more effective. And a lot of cities, there's a right of first refusal. When a building goes for sale, you have the tenants have the right to purchase it. you know, a 30-day window or something, and so there are ways that, you know, in some places, not really in Chicago, but in other places, they've tried to figure out, can we make it work, and will that keep it affordable? There's ownership vehicles like land trusts or co-ops that can be used to, you know, kind of preserve affordability over a long period of time. So there's really not like one like magic bullet type of solution, but sort of piecing together like all these different strategies. That's why it's somewhat complicated, you know, so yeah, so there's all sorts of different tools out there that could be deployed. Some of them exist, some of them are sort of, you know, have existed as a tool, but haven't really been perfected or really worked at scale. But anyway, so in this case, it's zoning, right? So another is zoning. So in this case, if you have a 2-flat or a 3-flat, maybe you create a process, because right now by rights, you can demo a 2-flat or you can convert a 2-flat into a single-family home. And there's no city process other than building permits maybe that would be required to, you know, halt or pause that process. So are there fees to impose on that process? Are there zoning changes you could request? So there's administrative things like that that could slow down. So anyways, quickly, so just noting like in this side, the left-hand side is of the single-family conversions, 77.8% were in high-cost neighborhoods. So concentrated in high-cost areas, non-residential vacant lots, 65% were in low-cost neighborhoods, right? So that's, you know, the market dynamic at play. Just looking at single-family conversions, you know, even more concentrated. So this is sort of the same set of areas, slightly reorganized, you know, in terms of which areas account for the most single-family conversions. North Center, you see Edgewater has made the list here. 3.5% of the city's conversions from 2-flats to single-family were in Edgewater over this period of time. This is a map showing the areas that with the highest number of these conversions. And then in Edgewater here, this sort of bar shows of all the lost 2 to 4s in Edgewater, how many, 68% of those were from 2-flats to single-family homes, right? So the significant majority went to single-family homes. 10.6% went to a vacant lot, maybe, you know, the example of someone demoing it for side lot purposes. 22% were removed pins, those are probably condos. And then other residential properties, small 7% were converted into some type of other rental property.
What's the deal with Westridge? 57.7% share replaced by non-residential land use?
So Westridge, not to go on a tangent, because I know we've been here for a while, I'm sure you're like that, but I'm happy to go on a tangent about Westridge. First, it's a small number. There weren't a lot of lost 2 to 4s in Westridge in general. But Westridge, there's a kind of a non-residential also includes like tax exempt properties, right? So in this data, we're including tax exempt properties, which are often vacant lots or city-owned, government-owned lots, or nonprofits as well. So Westridge actually has a lot of nonprofit-owned properties that were purchased by religious institutions that were converted from a residential property to a nonprofit religious housing of some sort or entity. So that's technically not residential. And so this is Edgewater, right? And this is sort of the area here. You can see if you look at the area. What's that?
Misericordia might have been doing some kind of.
You could, yeah. I mean, there's stuff like that. So yeah, if it becomes a nonprofit, then it or an academic institution or government, you know, property. Those are all examples of going from residential to non-residential. So this is, you know, zoomed into the North Lakefront area. So yeah, this is Edgewater here. So this little quadrant, this would be Bryn Mawr, Gloucester. I think this is Ashland and maybe Broadway here. So that's sort of the area that saw the most of this type of
Lakewood Balmoral.
Yeah, so that's where you see the most single family, 225 to single family conversion activity. And then, so yeah, like I'm going to show, this is like, there's sort of just some us noodling with data, trying to create what we're calling leading indicators that help us predict kind of where this might happen in the future, or tell us to understand what's driving some of these trends so that we can get ahead of them. So this is a chart showing the median sales price citywide of 2-flats versus single-family homes. Dark blue line, the median price of 2-flats. The light blue line, median price of single-family homes. You'll see that as of 2014, 2-flats were more valuable than single-family homes, and actually during the pandemic, that increased. Even the gap grew, and the 2-flats kind of remained stable. Whereas as of 2023, you saw single-family homes.
That's per unit?
This is just transaction price. So it's so just total sale prices, the median sale price of a single family versus a two flat. But this is sort of one archetype. This is North Center, right? So you can see that's a different dynamic where the price of single family homes as of 2005 exceeded the price of two flats, and that gap has grown. So now the average single family home in North Center is almost 1.2 million versus the average price of a two flat, not cheap, 800,000, but that's a gap of $400,000. So that's why that neighborhood is the #1 neighborhood for lost conversions of two flats to single family homes, because there's a market driver that is saying, hey, if I'm a developer, two flat goes in the market for $500,000, $600,000. If I buy that and keep it rental, there's no way that rent's going to be affordable because you got 2 units. That's a really expensive rent for a 2-unit building. But I do know I can find someone to pay over $1 million for a single family home. So that's sort of
the #1 market for McMansions.
Yeah, right, exactly. So what does it look like in Edgewater? Again, a little choppier, but you can see sort of a similar trend. So it's sort of, again, a relationship, because there aren't as many two flats or single family homes, the sales numbers are a little bit choppier, but yeah, as of about 2017, you saw single family homes pretty consistently being valued higher than two flats. So yeah, just a market driver. And when we look citywide, we see that these areas at the top are these light blue. These are all areas where this is such a gap between the price of single family homes versus two flats. Areas where single family homes are more valuable or have the positive side of the scale. Areas where they're less valuable, where two flats are more valuable, are on the left side. And you see the top 10. All these light blue areas are areas in the top 10 for converters. So you see a pretty significant correlation between single family homes being valued more than two flats and the loss of two flats of single family homes. But other thing to note is if you're interested in the state of the two flat industry in Chicago, the vast majority of neighborhoods, two flats are actually continuing to be a fairly profitable type of housing, stable type of housing. So the prices have gone up, the demand is still strong, but it's just in a small subset of neighborhoods where single family homes, because of changing demographics, changing demand for housing from higher income folks who have families, folks who want a yard and don't want to have a renter above them, those types of buyers are more common, and therefore that demand is sort of driving this transition in the housing stock. But it has implications for the broader rental market, because these properties, before being converted, provided an important type of low-cost rental housing. And yeah, just sort of thinking about going back to this sort of long-term owner thing. For two flats, Edgewater, similar to the 5+ unit buildings, has the highest share of two flats owned continuously by the same entity since we've got this bucketed out, but 48% have owned since 2000, and another 19% have owned bought the property before 2011. So basically almost 60% of two flat owners have owned their properties at least 10 years in Edgewater, which is above the city average. And then who are the owners? In Edgewater, you got 30.7% have no exemptions on that property, meaning they're probably rental buildings. Another 40% have a homeowner exemption, meaning they're owner-occupied likely, and then another 29% have a senior exemption, meaning they're owner-occupied but occupied by a senior, older adult. Again, that number, in terms of the exemption status, is only in Lincoln Square maybe has a higher share of two flats with an exemption, meaning owner-occupied and two flats. So this is relevant, especially on the older adult side. Older adults, may have home modification needs to age in place effectively, but they also may be the most likely to turn over and sell the building at some point. So when you're looking for, the risk of loss of the building and thinking of turnover is one of the drivers of that loss, then potentially those are a segment of the market to pay attention to, try to figure out how do we keep these people in place potentially and help them age in place comfortably. Or is there a way to create a pipeline into a different type of ownership that isn't the market? And yeah, so this is just a bunch of summarizing some of the big challenges, related to these different types of properties. Market demand is changing. Existing owners kind of need support in order to continue to own the property and keep it affordable. And then in some neighborhoods, disinvestment is really a driver of the loss of the stock. And so there's a different maybe set of strategies to try to reinvest in those neighborhoods. I think particularly around home ownership for 2 to 4 unit buildings, because we've seen a lot of new home buyers on the south and west sides buying two flats as owner-occupied property. So So yeah, that's the presentation. Wanted to try to answer everyone's questions as we went, so hopefully it was.
We integrated the Q&A
Yes,
section
right.
with the presentation, but if you have a few more minutes.
Happy to stick around.
And we also have a cake to celebrate our 36th anniversary as a society. We'll get to that. Please stop and have a piece.
Happy to answer other
Take
questions.
the last couple questions.
It's a general question, you know, Chicago is known as one of the most segregated cities. So, you know, how does the factor relate to what you're telling us here with increasing, you know, costs and so on, and the poverty is largely related among the black population?
Yeah, I mean, this map, I guess, is the best way to think about that. You know, thinking about them, that's why we tried to develop a market lens to interpret some of these trends, because there's different stuff going on in high-cost neighborhoods, which is kind of what Edgewater is, versus lower-cost neighborhoods, which is what you see on the south and west side. So, and all of that, there's a significant connection between the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhood and that sort of market value, market demand. So, so yeah, there was definitely, that's all a big part of the story for sure in terms of what's happening in different neighborhoods in the city. Yes.
I have a question about condo conversion into rental units. It's kind of a big topic in many areas. It seems that the rental market is going up. It's increasing, but the market for ownership is going down, largely because people under 40 simply cannot afford a down payment or can't afford to buy. So a developer looking at that scenario would say, let's get as many rental units as possible, because, and then they convert condos into apartments.
I mean, I think there's a few, I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but I think that from my understanding, there's a couple different things going on. One is, that's right, you know, that it's a cheaper way to, instead of building new rental housing, you have an existing multi-unit building that you can convert into rental units. But also, I think my understanding is that, and folks can correct me if I'm wrong, but that these are often older condo buildings that need significant like repairs. That they have like a $2 million special assessment coming down because they need to put in new windows or something like that. And the owner, the association maybe doesn't want to do that, so that's sort of a triggering event, right? Where there's a decision like, do we sell our building and not have to pay this $200,000 special assessment, or do we pay it? You know, I mean, I think that in many cases that's a driver of that.
A lot of the condos are rented out too, so.
And there's also a lot of rentals in the condos as well. Yes.
This has been a highly informative presentation, so of course we all are grateful. But there's a lot in those slides.
Yes.
Is there any way the slides could be made available?
Yeah, I can send it to John.
Hopefully have it on, we'll put it on our website, so yes.
Thank you.
And hopefully even the presentation in this talk itself.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
How would the Mayor Johnson referendum of raising the $100 million, speculate for me, how would he have used some of that money to alleviate the affordable housing?
So I mean, I think the one question there.
I'm sorry, I can't hear the answer.
Sorry, I mean, so, you know, it was, my understanding is the intent was to address homelessness. So homelessness is complicated, right? So it may, I don't know that it would have been purely to affordable housing, or if there are other types of housing that was more designed to address, you know, itinerant or, you know, difficult to house populations perhaps. That's a good question. As, you know, as everyone's noted, weren't a lot of details associated with how the money would have been deployed. So
That was our concern, and the other is that they emphasized it would be going to affordable housing, and I'm just wondering how would they, you know.
Yeah, I mean, like I said,
for that concept, and I know it's, you know, a very broad concept.
Yeah, Jack.
I'm answering a little bit to that, Mike, and but in general, so Geoff made a great presentation, but I would say that when he looks at affordability, you know, he talked about 150% of poverty, $41,000, and I'm going to say that's about the $1,000 a month rent. You know, it's about $1,000. So that's a concern, and that's a concern in places like this. But in Edgewater, in our community, homelessness and very low income, there's like more than 200,000 households in the city who make less than 25,000 income. So that's about a quarter or a fifth of our population make less than 25,000. And what I want to tell you is nothing is affordable to them. You cannot build affordable housing for them because they can't afford the operating costs, like basically $600 to $800 a month if you give the building away to the owner. And all he has to do is charge operating costs. That's not affordable. So the only way those people ever live in affordable housing is if they get some form of rental assistance. They can live in a Section 8 building, they can get a CHA voucher, they can, maybe the Low Income Housing Trust Fund. They need rental, they need income. They don't need a housing unit. And I don't know how they're going to use their $100 million, but building housing with it would be crazy. Okay. Giving people money, support services, and giving them money to go rent someplace and support them, social services. That's what needs, but I have no idea what they were going to do. Thank you.
One thing that I never read about in the discussion of that Bring Chicago Home proposal that failed was on the other side, people's ability to pay for housing, in terms of things like employment, full-time employment, minimum wages, nothing. Nothing about that.
Yeah, so it didn't pass, so move on, I guess. Yes.
I don't know if you talked about this, but I live on the lake, and I just wondered if there was rumblings of it turning into a national park or trying to convert our lakefront. Do you guys know anything about that? Put Chicago as a national, our parkland as a national park?
I don't, yeah.
That might be a future program.
Yeah, I don't know.
20 years ago.
A general question, I know over the last 20 years especially, we lost a lot of the SRO style buildings. Wouldn't it have made sense for the city to have just gone in and bought those things before for all the money we spend on affordable housing?
Yeah, they tried to, there is an ordinance that tried to make it, it was a bit of a, it was a bit of a quirky ordinance, I think. I don't know, I'm honestly not sure how successful it's been. I know it's preserved some, but lost some others, because I think it requires the new buyer to maintain it, as a SRO, but there's not financing available to do that work. So, I think that could have been a type of
just hopefully last point, because we're kind of breaking up here, but wouldn't it make the most sense for the city to subsidize the building of 2 to 3 unit buildings, since those are the greatest source of affordable?
I think preserving them, yeah. So not building new ones, but preserving the existing stock, investing in the existing stock so that they don't deteriorate.